I'll read you a little bit of chapter 3 of Emerald Star. What did the old shopwoman mean? Where was my father? Mamma had told me he'd run away to be a sailor. Was he still sailing now, far away in foreign climes? I remembered the old pink and yellow and green map in the classroom at the Foundling Hospital, and how I'd slid my finger around the edge of each land, imagining myself sailing the world. Perhaps father was really living that dream. I saw him in sailor's navy, his face tanned deep brown, his body braced as his ship rode the big waves. Tropical seabirds flew over his head, and marvellous dolphins frolicked in the wake as he sailed further and further away. Away from me. "Father!" I called into the wind, without quite meaning to. The girls on the rocks all stared at me, several giggling. I felt a fool and tried looking round too, as if also wondering who had cried out. I walked up and down the beach for a few minutes, collecting shells in a desultory fashion. Then I spotted a strange grey stone with a coiled imprint and picked it up eagerly. I stared at it in my cupped hands. I was back in my classroom again, remembering the pictures of fossils in the new set of science books donated by a rich governor. Our teacher hadn't taught from it. She considered it the work of the devil because it dealt with evolution, suggesting we were all descended from monkeys. "Imagine! Do you want to think your great-great-grandmothers and grandfathers had hideous furred faces and long tails?" she'd said. None of us knew our great-great-grandparents. We had no knowledge of any relative whatsoever, so could not take offence on their behalf. I did not mind the idea of simian ancestors and pictured myself happily swinging through the trees and sharing their bananas. I wanted to read the science book if it contained such interesting, controversial ideas, especially if it upset my teacher. I cordially hated her, especially as she'd once cruelly beaten my dear friend Polly. I sneaked into the classroom when we were meant to be outside taking the air and read eagerly, though the words were not as easy and inviting as a proper storybook. I learned about fossils, ancient small rocks with petrified little creatures trapped inside, turned to stone forever like a spell in a fairy tale. I had pored over the illustration, tracing the walls with my finger, and here was a real fossil. I examined the stone carefully, turning it over and over in my hand. It really was a fossil, rare and wonderful. How much would it be worth? Perhaps I was holding a fortune in my hand. One of the girls wandered towards me, dragging her pail. "What's that you've got there?" she asked. I put my hands behind my back, scared she might snatch my treasure away. I was still used to hospital ways. If you were ever lucky enough to be given a sweet by a gawping visitor, you had to hide it straight away, or one of the big girls would snatch it off you. This girl was certainly bigger than me. She towered over me, in fact, and she was sturdy too. But she was smiling at me in a friendly fashion. "Go on, show us," she said. "Have you found a pretty shell?" She spoke to me kindly, but as if I were about 5 years old. "I have found something much more rare and valuable," I said, with a proud nod of my head. "Let's see then." I reluctantly proffered my fossil. She stared at it. "Oh, lovely," she said. She looked as if she were trying not to laugh. "You don't know what it is," I said. "It's thousands and thousands of years old. It might be worth a fortune." "It's a fossil," said the girl matter-of-factly. "It's not worth any kind of fortune, not that sort. Digger Jeffries in the gem shop might give you a halfpenny for it, but nothing more. You are funny." "No, I'm not," I said. "I might start collecting fossils." I looked in her bucket. "So what are you collecting? Are they shells?" "They're flithers," she said. "They're not pretty at all," I said. "Of course they're not pretty," she said, giggling. "So why are you collecting them?" I stared at them in disgust. I'd seen cockles and whelks at Bignor. You don't eat them, do you? They're bait, silly, for the fishermen. Don't you know nothing? She said. I don't know these sorts of things, I said. I'm a stranger here. I'm visiting from London. She stared at me, actually looking impressed. You come all the way from London town, she said, as if it were Timbuktu. Yes, by myself, on 2 trains, I said nonchalantly. My, I've never even been across the moors, she said. What's London like then? Have you ever met the old Queen? I did once. Well, nearly, I said, on the day of her Golden Jubilee. Did you see her palace? Folks say all the houses in London are like palaces, built really big, with 9 rooms, 10 rooms, sometimes more, she said. There were many more rooms than that in the place I grew up, I said, truthfully enough. So what are you doing here then? She asked. My mama came from this village. Did you ever hear of an Ida Battersea? I asked eagerly, but the girl shook her head. I've never heard that name before, she said. Then have you perhaps heard of Bobby Waters? I said. She stared at me. Of course I have. We all know Big Bobby. What do you want with Bobby Waters? I pulled Lizzie's shawl more firmly around my head. I just need to have a word with him, but I believe he's away on a sea voyage. What? Oh yes, I'm with you. But he'll be back before noon, she said. Really? Before noon today? You're sure? She looked at me queerly and then crossed herself. Please God, yes, she said, and ran over to join her friends, prizing more flithers from the rocks. I couldn't believe the timeliness of my visit to Monksby. It seemed as if fate itself had thrust a hand forward and propelled me like a chess piece into the right place at the right time. Of course, I did not know for sure that this Bobby Waters was the right man. I only had the old shopwoman's word for it. And it was so strange and depressing that not a soul in this small, tight-knit community remembered poor Mamma. I felt her inside me, wound about my heart, and I could tell by the fierce beat that she was pleased I was back.